Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of Say Again. I'm your host, Amrita Tripathi, and I'm beyond delighted to have with us today Rishi Jaitly, who is someone I have had the honor and privilege of looking at how he works from close, from afar. I think, Rishi, you've witnessed really the tech zeitgeist. We've talked about this working at Google, Twitter, advising OpenAI, setting up this path-breaking leadership in tech school at Virginia Tech, where our paths overlapped again. Thank you so much for taking the time out.
It's my pleasure, Amrita. Thanks for having me.
So, Rishi, I was trying to think through how best to introduce you because you've done so many things, and I really think one of your skills, your superpowers, is connecting. You connect people really well. You connect the dots really well. You've connected businesses globally, and you focus on emerging markets almost from the get go. I think from Google onwards. Can you take us through a little bit about that journey and how you got into the world of tech?
Well, the world of technology happened rather serendipitously. If we'd done this interview, a quarter century ago, 25 years ago, and asked me what is technology, what is business, and what my future entails, the technology world and emerging markets and all that would not have surfaced. I think you're right, though, that I've always, and I encourage young people in particular, always try to zoom back to what an original passion was of theirs, or what gave them joy early on in their careers or even in their extracurricular activities. And for me, when I look back on college in particular, I was an entrepreneur there as well, but really, I spent a lot of time connecting people and launching programs on campus that were about ensuring we didn't leave to chance how connectivity happened on campus. And that's a very long story. And in many ways, my career in technology has been about not leaving to chance how ideas travel around the world. And as it relates to India, not leaving to chance how big purposeful ideas, many of which I've gotten to work for, don't leave to chance the depth with which they engage in India. So in many ways, you're right that my career at its highest level has been about that connectivity and fueling some connective tissue. My journey in technology started, my first job was as a speechwriter to Chairman and CEO of Google, Eric Schmidt. And again, it's a reminder of the wide range of skills one needs to win in technology. And the last thing I'll say is it wasn't obvious that I ought to end up in India and emerging markets, but I realized about just under 20 years ago that for me technology was a window to the world, and why not learn, frankly, about a place like India, and then also fuel connection and connectivity. So you're spot on in kind of detecting the right theme, and happy to go deeper on any of those.
Yes, I'd love to. And on this episode, I want to let our viewers and listeners know I do want to talk to Rishi about some of the big topics of the day, but also his own journey, some of the important things we've learned along the way about leadership, success, and failure. And Rishi, right now, it sounds like, with some of the headlines coming out of the US, it's an interesting time. It's a huge transition, of course, but we did see an uptick in sort of rhetoric and racist rhetoric against Indian Americans in particular in the recent past. Is there anything you can share from your vantage point? That seems to have cooled down a bit as we record now. But is there anything you can share from your vantage point there? How are you looking at this? Even if we zoom out a bit.
Yeah, no, it has been an interesting few months here in the United States. And I think what I'll flag for your audience and my own reflection is the fact of a conversation is, for me, healthy and intriguing. I've seen some of the polar opposites in the conversation. Let's say about H-1Bs and folks of Indian descent here in the United States. I, like many, have been witnessing that conversation. And for me, I guess what I'm intrigued by is just the fact that the conversation is happening. And I think that's actually healthy. I reflect on my own family's journey here in the United States. And I reflect on the fact that, it was a United States law in 1965, which led to the flow of immigrants from Asia and particularly South Asia to the United States. Now, if you look at data, it suggests that really in the mid 60s is when American real wages per capita started declining. And and I think for me it's worth sitting with that. We live in a culture where we need to jump straight to what's your view, what's your answer. But I think the fact of an open, candid conversation about these themes is critical. That's point one. Point two is, there's this interesting discussion about test scores and kind of quantitative skills as being sort of the most critical importance as it relates to the flourishing of the United States. And I guess my reflection on that, Amrita, is yes. And, I look back, I look at the careers of many of the folks I've admired in the business world, in the technology world, in the innovation landscape. I look at my own career. And yes, of course, a standard of excellence here has mattered. Yes, yes, quantitative output and test scores and grades mattered too. But so do matters of the spirit. Part of the success of nations, and particularly my home country, the United States, has not just been about hard left brain skills, right? It's been about a sensibility of wonder, adventure, frontier, risk taking. And I think folks are right to note that both matter, and that the future of our country depends not just on the importing of the world's highest standardized test scores, but a spirit as well. And so for me, I frankly welcome the conversation. I find it interesting. It is uncomfortable at times, right? Because my own family's journey to this country, my understanding of it has been complicated by folks reflecting back that that journey coincides with a other trends in American life. But I welcome that conversation, and I think we ought to not fear conversations that make us uncomfortable. And I also feel that American excellence, at least, amounts to more than just the sum of our grades.
Yeah, and you've been very vocal talking about the importance of the humanities when it comes to even leadership in tech, which we'll come to for a minute. And not to put you on the spot, though, do you feel that there has been a small but vocal group that has been saying some of the more, I suppose, the more racist remarks that obviously get flagged on things like on X or on social media? Do you think it's a small but vocal group?
I think perhaps it's been more noticed. I feel as though what's been true since time immemorial is there are always going to be, on any number of issues, voices that are particularly untoward in the way they reflect on a particular identity group or people. But I think there's also been many who have, I think, with civility and in a constructive way, reflected on these themes as well. And while some of that discourse may make me feel uncomfortable, I actually welcome it. I think part of what's necessary in life and in leadership is to be willing to have uncomfortable conversations that even make you feel and wonder how you know how you identify a bit. And so for me, you know, content like that is showing up on my feed a little bit more now and then. But I, for me, I think part of the tradition that at least I try to represent is one of civil conversation, and I've seen plenty of that too.
And it is, as you said, a time of transition is a time to expand the conversation, not constrict it perhaps further. You're
Absolutely.
also at the heart of a really interesting time when it comes to AI. It's been called many things, like I think the new arms race. The U.S. and China are widely seen as the big. It's the sort of two-pronged race. What can you share with us from your point of view? And of course, you were advising OpenAI for a while. I think all of the headlines in India have. So, for anyone listening or watching, Rishi has long been the wunderkind of tech for Indians. I think from your time at Twitter, obviously before that at Google, you're here as well. But you've been privy to a lot of discussions, which I'm sure you can't share anything confidential with us. But how do you look at this when it's positioned as an arms race? When there's this whole talk about should it have been a not-for-profit, a for-profit, because sort of the good of humanity is at stake. What's your take?
I think you're spot on to note that, quote, when it's positioned as an arms race. And in my estimation, that's a choice. That's a framing choice that's been made by protagonists in the ecosystem. If you look back on kind of the year one post the release of ChatGPT, I've at least my macro observation was that there's a lot of regulatory attention devoted in this country to what do we do with this super intelligence from a regulatory standpoint. My feeling is that that conversation is faded now. There's a general excitement about invest in these technologies, and I think one explanation for that is that the conversation around AI has been framed geopolitically. It is an us versus them, if not us them, zero summy conversation. And while I'm not a deep expert in these areas, and others study this full time, I question that framing device. And I think that there are many in our kind of tech ecosystem and in our political ecosystems that are like me, wondering why are things constantly framed in us them zero summy ways. Might there be another way? And I think there I think the launch of DeepSeek is an interesting example of, the two ways to receive it, right? One way to receive it is to perpetuate the narrative of us them, and we need to invest harder. Another is to say, gosh, there are many markets now. Let a thousand flowers bloom, and let's compete. So I think you're right to flag that it's a framing choice. I I wonder whether there might be another way to frame this that doesn't undermine American ambition, but models a kind of discourse that's less othery, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I wonder if that could happen given the climate right now, or maybe how that narrative has sort of taken root. It looks like globally. On your trips to India, when you go back and forth, what are some of the things that strike you? And I do want to talk to you also a little bit about the deeper connections you have, because you did move here with your family many years ago, and then on to Singapore and so on. So, what are some of the changes that have struck you? And if we're sticking to that sort of tech ecosystem lens, you've of course seen a lot of innovation here. You co-founded Times Bridge, making sure that investments were connecting up with the right people. What are some of the things that you think have changed over the last since you started visiting India?
Yeah, I think at least on AI in particular, obviously a ton of excitement above the fold. There's optimism, there's excitement, there's poetry, around the prospects of artificial intelligence in India. India doesn't suffer from lack of poetry, and one of the things I've reflected on a lot in my couple of decades in and out of India, in many ways over-indexes on poetry. The world's largest this, the world's biggest blank, the world's most exciting ABC. And and I think that's wonderful. I think what sits next to poetry is prose, right? The opportunity to execute and deliver on a per capita basis innovation that wows the world. And I think for me, where I get most excited in India on AI or any real issue is when folks transcend kind of the excitement and and quietly focus on the pros of execution. And I think that's what you're beginning to see in India, from where I sit, at least in the last couple of, even just in the last couple of weeks. Obviously, OpenAI was just in India, I believe, this week as we record this. And I think with developers, with the government's push on foundational models, I think there's a recognition of, okay, the story's been told. It's time now to build and wow, the nation and the world. And so I think that journey to me has been really interesting to be a part of, sort of a country that has got swagger and self-confidence, and ensuring there's no daylight between the talk and the walk.
Yeah.
And and I think on so many in so many other ecosystems, that gap continues to close, and that's where I think India's opportunity to inspire is. And so that's my quick reflection on AI and the sense of optimism. In many ways, I think the kind of optimism and energy you see in India around AI is sort of what's now being mimicked here in the West. I think that for sort of year one after the launch of GPT, there was a lot of there was a lot of concern here about what might this do to upend business models and existing institutions. I think now we're actually mimicking the kind of let's go orientation that India has had from day zero on this.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So, I was at that Jaipur Literature Festival. We spoke about it briefly, and I was moderating a panel on entrepreneurship. And there was a question to Mr. Amitabh Kant, who used to, run this Niti Aayog, and he's the G20 Sherpa. And they were asking what he thinks that people should focus on in AI. And they asked the whole panel, and his was just like, look at the biggest issues like air pollution. Look at where can you actually use AI and start building for social impact, which actually links back to how I look at your career, because I feel like you've gone from not for profit, you've done big tech, you're in academia right now with a sort of foray into entrepreneurship. but you've always had this, it feels like this real spirit and passion for public service. So can you tell us how that all comes together? And I have to say, Rishi, you're one of the few people who can juggle all these things and make it sound coherent. So when you pull that through line through your career and your interests, how does this all stack up for you?
Well, two things. First, on what you said with respect to Mr. Khan's comment, I think one of the interesting things with respect to AI and technology generally, and maybe this shows up in a big way in India, is there's this tendency to want to presuppose its utility, presuppose how it's going to make a difference. Let's declare our major first around what's the destination here, and I think there is room for that. I think sitting next to that ought to be just the research and technology and really any field of inquiry and its intrinsic value. In other words, not constantly wondering what the utility of a pursuit and around a passion, whether it's in the science and technology world or in the humanities world, um, not constantly anchoring in in an if X then Y, what's the Y? If X is sufficient, actually. And I think part of what you've seen with the rise of at least OpenAI here and its origins as a research lab, right? The prioritization of the research having intrinsic value without presupposing its outcome is in many ways what's led to the launch of GPT. With respect to public service and my origins there, I think maybe the easiest way to kind of land the plane there is that when you ensure, whether it's in your intellectual life or in your practitioner life, you are constantly finding windows to engage on public issues. I think you train your mind to think in at the highest altitude, and that ends up being valuable in business and technology, right? So what is public policy work, what is political work, what is public affairs work? It's ultimately the ability to think at the level of the forest, not at the level of the tree, and imagining what a community, a country might look like in 10 years, 20 years, et cetera. You're constantly having to detect signal from noise and transcend density to develop vision. And so for me, I started my career thinking it would begin, and it did begin in kind of politics and nonprofit work and education reform. And I found myself in a very long story in technology, initially with public policy roles, but over time with kind of generalist management and leadership roles. And a lot of people ask me, how did this all fit together? And I think for me, I think what has continued to be most valuable is just thinking and being able to act at the highest altitude, because we, particularly in markets like India, where it's very easy to get very busy very quickly, and there's so much density of ideas and opportunity and partnerships. It's very easy to reach a point of diminishing return on output. And so being able to kind of constantly be taking a step back and thinking about what are my biggest leverage points on any given issue, I think has been really how I've connected the dots. I mean, you know, I'll admit part of it also might, part of what I also benefited from was that global Silicon Valley self-identified for many of the years I was in and around Silicon Valley as a change agent, as a public utility of sorts. And we can have a debate about whether that's still how the industry self-identifies, but because companies like Google in the 2000s, Twitter in the 2010s, and OpenAI in the 2020s, all of which I've been able to part of, framed and self-identified themselves in public terms, I think people like me who had kind of dashed in and out of the sector with experiences in nonprofits and public institutions maybe were more attractive or better fits for the seasons I was there, right? These companies have certainly morphed and have different cultures from what I recall, but that's maybe another way in which the dots have kind of connected, and hope that's helpful.
No, yeah, definitely helpful. Also because it's interesting as you said, and I'd love to bring in this idea you've sort of articulated and kind of planted your flag when it comes to leadership in tech and why it needs, you need ethics, you need history, you need the humanities. Can you talk us through a little bit of that and how you feel, if you still feel in 2025 this is more relevant than ever? You have said this is, an age of, sort of AI ascendant age that we're entering. Why do we think the humanities, the classics, ethics, and so on are important when it comes to tech leadership?
Yeah, no, I think And I think the quickest version of the answer is that they always have been important. I think part of my recognition in my 2+ decades in and around technology, and then also being a student of Silicon Valley history and the history of technology, which by the way is its own discipline, is, gosh, these sensibilities we tend to attach with the liberal arts and the humanities have always been determinate, actually. And so you can go way back and try to characterize the nature of innovators and invention going back centuries. But certainly in recent decades, from Steve Jobs' appreciation of the liberal arts to the founder of AOL here in the United States being a politics major, to the founder of Reddit being a history major, to the founder of Airbnb being designers, to a founder of LinkedIn studying philosophy, to the founder of Slack being a philosophy major. I think, and then looking back on my own career and thinking about this student of history, the student of Indian history, the student of U.S. Indian relations, found his way into building a business in many ways about U.S. Indian relations. And I also reflected, of course, on the differences in human organizations between people at the manager level and the SVP level. Is it that the SVP is a better coder or uh, more adept with Microsoft Excel? I think we can all agree it's something else. And so part of what I was responding to was, gosh, this has always been true. It's always been true that those that are able to break through in leadership are storytellers and story listeners, introspectors and imaginers, curious before they develop conviction. So then the question is, how do you teach that? Can you teach it? How do you create a culture that validates that? And so part of my latest mission is to build a stage, build an identity, build a brand, build a culture around, and certainly build a program around a higher sort of leadership and technology. And the last thing I'll say is, leadership and technology isn't the only hill to fall on here, as we say here, to use a military metaphor. I mean, part of what I'm most excited about isn't just folks in and around technology reappreciating and being celebrated for their deeply felt human skills, but people from all walks of life. I dream of a world, I mean, going back to our earlier conversation about controversies here in the United States and our political discourse, I dream of a world where these experiences and a culture that emanates from the humanities is vibrant in all ecosystems. Imagine physicians and politicians and young people all feeling grounded in what we're talking about. I think that's a better world with more healthy discourse. And so very excited. And I couldn't believe that a frame and a platform and a program like this didn't exist, which is why I had to start it.
And yes, and of course, like I will always be one of the first cohort at the
Of
Leadership
course,
and Tech Institute at Virginia Tech,
making
and
history.
and the cohort is really, it's pretty incredible how those relationships kicked off, and and still last a year and change later. I think what's really fascinating about that, Rishi, is everyone who hears about the program or has spoken to you since you set it up, it always sounded like they wanted to know how they could maybe replicate it, how could they get
Right.
inspired by it, how do they spread it. Is that something you're still hearing? Is it
I
still in?
still hear that, but you'll appreciate this as a fellow entrepreneur who's brought and birthed new things in the world. There's a there's a difference between ideas and execution, right? And I used to, when I was in technology at both Google and at Twitter, I used to fret, of course, gosh, we have this big idea at Google, we have this big idea at Twitter. What if it's copied quickly by the competition, right? And I remember one of my mentors said all day, look, everybody's got this idea. Perspiration is where you'll make the difference. Inspiration matters, but so does perspiration. And so I think one of the things I've learned even in this startup, this school, is at the top of the funnel, on the elevator, on a phone call, people are always wowed, right? But to go from top of the funnel, that's intriguing, to the bottom of the funnel, I like you, I'm going to do this program, or I'm going to build something similar. That's a journey, right? That's a journey, and there are many leaps of faith in that journey. But yes, I continue. In fact, today, many of my meetings today are with other universities here in the United States about this program and about how it might be replicated and launched elsewhere. So yes, I continue to have a lot of folks, not just in higher education, but in the business world and in entrepreneurship lands, ask about what they might draw from this new approach to upskilling, this new approach to lifelong learning, this new approach to higher education that they might mimic in their own businesses. So there's still a lot of that. We're never going to reach every customer or beneficiary. So most of the change we'll realize in the world is just through our story.
Yeah, that's true. And then, but that is a very powerful thing. The way stories shape the world, I think, is a whole different conversation that we could probably have.
Yeah.
Um, I do want to ask you, Rishi. I think you're someone who, as a leader, has inspired so many, your teams, people you've come into contact with. Is it something that you have been able to upskill yourself, like in terms of leadership? How did you become a good leader? And I'm going to say this without embarrassing you, but pretty much everyone connected with Rishi will be like, he's the person who talks you up when you're not in the room, who goes to bat for you. You've been an incredible ally. I feel like even when I started the Health Collective, the mental health advocacy and storytelling platform, you'd send positive messages and sort of validate. And it's not just me; it's lots of people. So I'm curious to know how your leadership style has evolved, and is it something you've consciously thought about, like how do I get more empathetic? How do I show up as a better ally? And do you think it can even be taught?
It's really interesting. One of the things I've absolutely struggled with in my own career, because so much of my career has been about, building platforms that unlock the voices and potential of others. One of the things, both in technology and certainly now in education, one of the nagging questions always has been, what about my voice? What about my light? What about my learning and my growth? And so I don't think I've been as intentional about it as people might think. I certainly have been too busy building and leading, so to speak, that I haven't had as much time as folks might think to self-actualize around what's a better me look like, at least as a leader in a couple of years. I think I've benefited from kind of just the cumulative effect of trial by fire has really helped me quite a bit. I think probably the best answer to your question is, it starts with this quote and frame: you can't be what you can't see. And so I think because I've so many leadership reference points or in me, that I think part of the way I grow is by mimicking those I've seen. I'll pick up ways in which others I admire speak, listen, lead, ask, support, celebrate, side, and that will show up in me in subconscious and conscious ways. And there's a wonderful book that we assigned in our program this year as a pre-read. It's called The Worlds I See by Dr. Fei-Fei Li. Dr. Fei-Fei Li is one of the pioneers of this AI era. She essentially invented ImageNet, which is the technology that when you're on your phone and you type in cat or dog, your phone will surface the picture of the cat or dog. And so she's at Stanford and one of the pioneers. And one of the arguments she makes is that visual intelligence, the more humans see, it does something to you neurologically. It correlates highly with your intellectual development. Literally, sight correlates, and in many ways, the way it, it it corresponds with how these AI systems are being trained on the basis of visual stimuli. And and so for me, as I think about my leadership, I think what I've benefited from is literally just having seen a lot of leaders. And I'd encourage folks to widen their aperture of the number of folks they're exposed to. And yes, there are little moments where I sort of get self-aware and say, did I do that right? But mostly I'm kind of making it up as I go and trusting on the width and breadth of my reference points coming in handy in particularly important moments.
Love that. What about, more people seem to have exposure to this sort of not the kind of leader you want to be. So the examples you don't want.
There you
So have you
go.
ever had, have you ever had to deal with toxic workplaces or difficult, managers I mean, everyone seems to have by this point in their career. And do you have any strategies for that?
I probably haven't dealt with, what I'd call, toxic and things like that. I think one of the things I've resolved, often in my career is knowing when to leave, knowing when to move on from an emergent culture that isn't me. And I'd encourage most folks to be mindful of what's worse, leaving a year too early or staying a year too late. And I think for me, it's absolutely been the former. I've made decisions in my career that have probably even affected my commercial prospects because I've decided to leave a little early because I sensed the emergence of a culture, maybe even a leadership culture that just wasn't me. And that's okay. Every organization evolves. This invisible force called culture is a thing. And so for me, I think my best coping mechanism has been to move on. And it's not just companies, by the way, right? It's not just organizations. It's places. It's where you live. I mean, the other thing I've benefited from is I've moved a lot, right? I grew up in New York City, but I've lived in, many countries and many cities, and we've moved a ton. And so I think part of that also is how I constantly ensure I'm in cultures that inspire me, that can teach me. And I'm really lucky now here in Blacksburg, Virginia, at Virginia Tech, to be benefiting from a culture that feels like me.
That's very inspiring. I do want to ask you because you've always had that since I've known you, that kind of sort of global feel, like a global citizen. Like you're obviously American, and you've had that exposure to Silicon Valley and the big tech. But can you take us through a little bit about some of the things you might have learned from moving bag and baggage? So it's not just like the 1 or 2 week trips or 3 day trips. It's actually living in different countries. I think it was India, it was Singapore. There's been some others, but
Yeah.
also within the US, like you say, very different New York to a Blacksburg.
Yeah,
Take
that's
us
right.
through a little bit.
I grew up in New York City, and went to school in Connecticut and New Jersey, so kind of a New York City area, really. But I've lived all over the place, from Washington and San Francisco to Delhi, Bombay, and Singapore, to Detroit, and many places in Virginia and more. I'm sure I'm missing. I think maybe what might be useful to hear is that we all have an inner expat. I think, and I think the humanities, and not the humanities, but one of the joys in life is just finding ways to channel your inner expat. If you think about the expat, whether you've been an expat or not, if you're a journalist, you think about foreign correspondents sitting in capital cities somewhere in the world, right? They've never been, they're thrown into a foreign capital and say, you're going to report on this capital for a year. What do you need to bring to bear to be successful, right? It's an element of observation, of anthropology, of trust building, of question asking, of adapting, and so much more, and while retaining a sense of you, while becoming the place too. And I think part of what's happened to me in my career, not and I will 100% credit my initial expat experience in Delhi back in '07 with this, is I I turned on my inner expat. I kind of, that muscle was awakened, and it's never turned off since. And I think I'd encourage folks to, whether you're moving around or not, we all have an inner expat. One of the things we joke about here is, when we travel, we get our Lonely Planet books out, we build itineraries, we immerse. And yet here in where you live, we tend to not do that, right? You tend to take for granted what's around you. And so I've tried to be you know I guess a global citizen, but at my heart, I believe in localism. I'm a and that was the power of technology, to get local quickly. And in many ways, even my journey in technology was about helping companies get local. So I think a localist at heart and place-based leadership has always brought me the most joy.
And you're also, I think, someone we could ask a little bit about. Increasingly we're seeing the more people are sort of connected socially, and as much as social has helped us kind of flatline hierarchies of access, there seems to be this increasing isolation. Well, this is the premise of my novel, so I'm going
Yeah.
to presume this is true. We've also heard, of course, the Vivek Murthy talking about this, the US Surgeon General, like loneliness is becoming a challenge, especially in big cities. How important do you think it is to find ways to connect with your community, whatever the age group? Because it seems to be easier when you're kids, of course. Like when children and students tend to have it easier in terms of immersing, because that's just the way the education system is set up. How important is it, do you think, for us to make a conscious effort as adults?
Well, absolutely. Finding your tribe is hard as an adult, and it was much easier when you're a kid, because you just embrace the tribe you're around. And so, absolutely, I think I'll defer to experts like Dr. Murthy on why that's important. I think what I might offer to that conversation is what sits next to community and finding your tribe, right? In terms of solving for or advancing well-being. And I think part of the answer is calling, is having a feel for your calling. Um, and I think though answering that question comes in many ways from one's intuition. And I think that's where the humanities can play a big role, right? I think that we all have an interior life, and we have an exterior life. And of course, we've built a culture where we're in many ways increasingly addicted to the dopamine that comes from exterior, right? And I think in many ways this yearn for community is a realization that digital dopamine can only go so far. And and yes, and so absolutely, we should prioritize living a more vibrant exterior life. And there are lots of political currents in that space, from banning school phones in schools to many wonderful initiatives. But I would also flag the importance of one's interior life in and what it can do to one's angst and one's aspirations. And I think that's where I think the humanities can be profoundly important, because if you've turned on an always on habit of curiosity, of anchoring in human others, in being you know, wowed by everything in the arts, I think you develop a deeper and more satisfied sense of self. And I think that strength and that resilience is helpful when your exterior life feels like the reservoir isn't as full, because you've got a full interior life reservoir. And I think it's one of the things I've benefited from is, moved around a lot. Obviously that does things to one's sense of community when you're moving around a lot. I've had kind of an off the beaten path career where I've got good friends in lots of different places, and I struggle with that. But I think what's always proved help me is a sense that this is my calling. I feel really comfortable with it, and I feel really alive internally. And I think that's always been really helpful in the context of well-being and mental health.
And you've always spoken about the importance of mental health. Like, I mean, that you're someone who's spoken about how we should take this seriously. I do want to ask you, how you define, and keeping an eye on the time. So we'll start winding down a bit with a couple more questions on how you look at success and failure in your own career. So if you have any examples, and your perspective might have changed over time as it tends to do, how you've weathered some of these storms. When you talk about resilience, what's helped you? Can you share any anecdotes?
Well, there's a story that comes to mind from a prominent athlete here in the United States, Aaron Rodgers, who's a quarterback in American football here. And after he won the Super Bowl, I can't remember how many years ago, maybe 10 years ago, some in the last decade ish, he the next day said something like, "Wait, is that it?" In other words, he reached the pinnacle of success, and I'd encourage you and your listeners to look it up. And he reached the pinnacle of his sport, made all the money more money than he could have dreamed of, won the world championship, and yet felt like there was a part of him that felt a little empty. Like, wait, what? And I can relate to that in some respect, right? I mean, I think we set our lives up for these peaks and these summits, and yet when you're on those summits, you realize that the orchestra isn't playing and the notes aren't crescendoing the way you thought they would. And it's in fact the peace you feel in the journey that's far more fulfilling than the pride you feel at the top. And so for me, that's been probably a huge learning, and it's taken some learning to realize that peace over pride is been far more important. I have a lot of friends that have been super successful in a wide range of sectors, and you just constantly hear this over and over again. And so for me, that's how I think about success, is sort of making sure that I'm, however difficult it is, however much steel it takes for me to do what I think makes sense for me, to stay steely about that, because that's where my peace is going to come from. And I think that's protected me from the roller coaster of highs that don't, highs that don't feel like highs, and lows that feel like lows. I feel like I feel like I've sort of stayed true. And so I'd encourage folks to kind of keep a metaphor like that important in mind. And I know it's hard, when we live in it, when we make those big decisions, those big leaps of faith, we're surrounded by a culture that tells us, shows us daily what might have been. I feel that all the time, right? I've made some counterintuitive decisions throughout my career, and I open my phone and I see the example of folks that stayed when I left. That and so it takes some steel to say, well, I'm going to be proud of me for being me. And I know that's hard, and that's in part I know why we're having this conversation.
Yeah, no, thank you. That actually really is important because I feel like the same way, especially when you do sort of, mid-career transitions, or you're like, as you said, leaving a little bit before maybe taking a counterintuitive decision. But knowing what you're trying to build and what you stand for is such an important piece of this. Just a couple more questions for the moment, Rishi, though I definitely hope to have you back on at some point this year.
Absolutely. Great.
Um, is there anything you're reading or watching that you'd like to recommend?
Ooh, wow. Not enough. I think for me on the reading front, I enjoy reading biography and autobiography. And so at the moment, I'm reading a biography of John F. Kennedy, the former U.S. president, just sort of a take on his presidency given our political moment. The Kennedy family is obviously back in the zeitgeist here in the United States. And so there's a lot of interesting discourse around what might John F. Kennedy had thought, were he alive right now, where might he stand politically? And so I'm reading a couple of books that reflect on his politics and try to assess them from what we know today. That's probably the first thing that comes to mind. And other than that, I'm looking for recommendations. I'm kind of in a what should I watch mode, but I try to I spend most of my time reading, probably too much of my time reading nonfiction biography.
Nonfiction mainly. Well, I was watching Mo. I don't know if you've seen this show on Netflix. It's actually so good. It's
I
this
think so.
comedian,
Okay.
Palestinian American. Like it's actually
Wow.
very relevant. So I'll ping that across to you. Anyone who has good recommendations for Rishi, please tag us when you send them. And finally, for the moment, Rishi, is there something you'd like to share that you're grateful for? Is there anything you do in terms of gratitude as a practice, or if you'd like to share something?
Well, I try to go on gratitude walks and thank you walks, and those are sort of walks where I actually try to say out loud, verbally, what I'm thankful for and who I'm thankful for. So I'll use this occasion to say thank you to you, Amrita. I feel, part of what's been interesting about my career is I've referenced a range of leaps of faith I've had to take, but in every single leap, there have been others that have had to leap with me or towards me, or you know say that was a good leap. And so you're one of those people, right? I mean, to join my mission a couple of years ago when it was brand new, my latest mission, I think, was a leap of faith on your part, and I think as it was for many of the other folks who joined me. So I'm just grateful for the leaps of faith others have taken in my own leaps, and knowing that it's not hard, and I'll look forward to all that's to come.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you so much. And for those of you listening till the end, shout out to Sai for giving me the idea about doing ending with gratitude. And Rishi, basically the genesis of this podcast was a conversation we had. So thank you so much. And thank you for taking out the time from your busy schedule. I appreciate you.
It's my pleasure. I create conversations like these. Thank you so much, Amrita.